Hi, my name's Andrew Gregson, and today you're listening to Chamber Talk. Our special guest today is Kevin O'Leary. He is a political scientist at Champman University and a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the UC Irvine. Did I say that right there? This is going to really trip me up here today, Kevin, so thanks for coming on. Why don't you tell a little bit about who you are and what you do?
All right. I spent my career in part as a journalist. I was the lead West Coast reporter for Time. I've been an LA Times reporter. I was editor of OC Metro in its heyday, and a few other things along the way. I'm a graduate of UCLA. I earned my doctorate at Yale. Before that, I was a Coro Fellow in Public Affairs in Los Angeles. That's a great program. My wife and I are longtime residents of Irvine. I'm the author, most recently, of Madison's Sorrow, Today's War on the Founders and America's Liberal Ideal. It was published by Pegasus Books. You can find it on Simon & Schuster, Amazon, and Audible. It traces America's liberal ideal and reactionary resistance across the whole of our history and explains how and why American politics arrived at this strange and dangerous juncture. I'm also the co-founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Saving Democracy, a small group. And we'll take it from here. Thank you for the introduction and having me on, Andrew. As you know, I tell this when I speak to audiences around the county, which I've been doing, that public speaking comes with a risk. As Lincoln said, it's better to remain silent and be thought of a fool than to speak out and remove all doubt. So having said that, I'll plunge in. My talk is, and this podcast is about business and the fabric of democracy. Since August, I've been giving this talk called The Fabric of Democracy to Rotary and Kiwanis clubs across Orange County. And as I mentioned, I spent part of my career as a journalist and political scientist. The impetus to reach out to a wider audience and chamber groups is due in part to my professor I had when I was at Yale, Juan Lentz. He grew up in Spain and was a child during the Spanish Civil War that broke out after democracy collapsed. Franco was the dictator who took over for 40 years. It was an awful experience, and it made Juan, he gave his life's work to understand just why democracies get into trouble and fall apart and break down. If they gave out Nobel Prizes to political scientists like they do for economists, Lentz would be on the list. He's that important. About 10 to 15 years ago, I began to see patterns that Juan Lentz had spoken of suddenly show up in American politics, and I was surprised and disheartened. And so this talk is my way of giving back to the community with this knowledge I have. My goal is to give the audience a little history and a few concepts, tools, you will, for which to make sense of this new crazy political reality that we live in. As I proceed, you'll see there are four themes. One is the values we share. The second is our history. The third is the danger of extremism. And the fourth is the special position of business in our democracy.
So talking about democracy, I'm assuming maybe we should start off with Kevin, about maybe the system and the laws and anything else that has to do with it.
Yeah, so we always think about the Constitution and the laws, and certainly those are important. But during the post-war era, political scientists and journalists and the society at large, we got trapped in a way in talking about democracy as the democratic process, like a set of rights. And they were, in a way, like it's just assumed that they're going to be there, but there were political values above that. And in a way, that was a mistake because democracy is about values. So if you think about the values we share, and for example, the Rotary clubs, they have these four values that
four-way test, yeah.
Four-way test. And if you think about the values that we share, honesty, decency, neighborliness, hard work, assisting those in need, just anybody who grows up in a good community with a good family in America knows this. Those values, I submit, are just as important and just as big a part of democracy as elections and voting and jury duty. And this is kind of an ethos we share, spirit of community. Now, one of the famous writers about American politics was a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville. People have heard that name, and his famous book was called Democracy in America, written back in the early days of the 19th century. And he said, look, if you look at other countries, they have constitutions, they have laws, but often it doesn't work out. Why is America working out and other places aren't? And he said it was norms, what he called habits of the heart, what he called mores in French. And that's the key. You have to kind of have these shared values, right? That's what holds everything together. That's what underlies everything. That people believe in the system, and we believe in democracy. Now, a more recent take on that is the Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam. And he's famous for his book called Bowling Alone, about kind of the decrease in civic participation in America. But his great book is the one prior called Making Democracy Work, which was a study about the vast differences between northern and southern Italy. So you think about from Rome north, Florence, Milan, and all those little towns. He said he was studying what he calls social capital. And those are the norms of trust and honesty and civic participation that characterize northern Italy. They score high on that. But if you look at southern Italy, the trust exists really only inside the family. Is a really good trust. And there's more suspicion, there's more anger, there's more criminal activity. And that deterioration of trust makes a difference in how the economy performs and how the society performs and whether you can really have a thriving democracy.
Because they relate.
Yeah.
Right.
So we want to keep nurturing this social capital, these norms, and understand that's the fabric. We can't see it, it's invisible, but it's there, right? We feel it. Now, another important thing that Tocqueville talked about was we were very individualistic. He thought that was great, but he thought you could take it too far. You don't want people just focusing on themselves and their family and maybe just their business associations. You have to think about the wider community as well. And so he talked about self-interest properly understood. And by what he meant by that was in the old days, somebody else's barn burned down. Well, the other local farmers would get together and help rebuild a barn for that neighbor, right? And we do the same thing today. People, whenever there's a natural disaster, Americans are famous for giving, right? Yeah. Money. And we know in communities that work in America that are really tight, people are participating in, AYSO. They're in the Chamber of Commerce. They're at the PTA. They're involved, right?
Right. Yeah.
So we want that to continue. We want also, in terms of this conversation, we want the business community to remember that they're part of the wider community, and people that are members of the chamber are doing that. A second theme I want to bring up is that kind of the history behind all this. And because we live in America and we're almost 250 years of democracy, right? We kind of assume that's the way of the world, right? We haven't lived with anything else.
Right.
So unless we've traveled and been someplace else,
don't know
right,
too
to an
much about
authoritarian situation, you don't know. And plus, if you go to the authoritarian situation as an American, you still got your U.S. passport. As long as you got that, baby, you can get out if things fall apart, right?
Yeah,
we know that. That gives us, it's like a security blanket.
Yeah.
Now, that's us. But if you look at history in general, it turns out, guess what? Democracy is extremely rare, right? You go back, it's expressed somewhat in the Jewish Bible. It comes to fore with Greece, ancient Greece and Athens, and everybody knows about that, right? But then it's in the Roman Republic, when it's a republic and not an empire, before Caesar. And then it's in Florence a little bit, in Venice to some extent, but not fully out there. And then the English Revolution is interesting. It's way back in time for Americans. Few Americans understand it or know that much about it. 1640 to 1660, way back in time. But the radical edge of that was foretold the future. People were talking about individual rights. People were talking about the right to vote. People were talking about equality. And so that got into the culture. The outcome of the English Revolution was that the Parliament got more power vis-a-vis the king, right? One of the kings lost his head in the English Revolution, and then 11 years later, they brought back the king. And ever since then, Parliament had power and got more, right? So democracy came to England kind of more gradually than America. For us, the Puritans and other people left Europe, but they brought those ideas of the English Revolution to here.
Right.
And the rule under colonial rule with the king was mild in the sense you had an English governor, but they had town halls. They had, the House of Burgesses was their parliament in Virginia, and everybody was running their show. We were practicing democracy for 100 years before the revolution. But that's the rarity. Most places, most countries throughout human history, it's autocracy, it's monarchy, it's oligarchy. It's the rule of one or the few. And everybody else be damned. It's not a good situation if you're on the outs. If you're in the majority, basically, right?
So the majority of us, it might seem that they're a democracy from what we're seeing, but we weren't physically there and maybe living amongst it and seeing how different it really is then.
Yeah, and how it feels and how it's so I mean, especially now because democracy is like the thing. Even if you're a big dictator, say like Putin, you still run elections, even though you're sure you're going to get 97% of the vote, and your leading opponent, well, you send it to prison in Siberia.
Right, but we're thinking, because we're seeing the news, oh yeah, it's a normal place, but in fact, no, it's
so
right.
Democracy is in it's a name and it's hollow. There's nothing there, right? So you want to watch out for that, sure. So the basic choice is this: do you have a democracy or a autocracy? And another way to think of it is to say, do you want to be a citizen or a powerless subject? Because that's what happens if somebody else is running the show and you don't have the power to vote, you don't have the power to participate. And without a constitution, you do not have individual rights. You can forget the right to property. People can do whatever they want with your business. Not good. Look at China right now, right? People that have done well with Chinese capitalism, but the political system is still the Chinese Communist Party. And if they go a slightly different direction, which they're doing right now, a little more hardcore, some of the businesses lose out. Right? And a side note on that, you can have a mellow autocrat, right? Franco at the end of his rule was much different than Franco at the beginning. And it was a peaceful place. You didn't, nobody felt threatened. It was fine. But that's unusual, and Thomas Paine really understood this. That generation, the founding generation, understood what they were up against. And Paine wrote exquisitely about hereditary sovereignty, hereditary monarchy. And he said the problem is you can have a good king, right, that's actually pretty good, like Queen Elizabeth.
Right.
But the chances are you're going to get somebody who's incompetent or doesn't care, or worse, you're going to get a tyrant. And you can get a really brutal situation. And that happens a lot. So you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to get in that situation. Right, so we're left with democracy, which Churchill famously called the worst form of government except all the others, because we haven't invented anything better. So it's sloppy, it's chaotic, it's frustrating as hell, right? But what democracy does is wonderful. It gives people ultimate sovereignty. We have sovereignty. It's our country. It recognizes the reality of human equality, which is a truth. It also asks us to rely on our collective intelligence, which we're always smarter as a group than a single person, to craft the future we want, right? So you may be frustrated. A lot of people are frustrated with the system. We know we need some reforms, but we've done it before. We can do it again. So that's you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater situation, right? We were mentioning this before, that in the modern world, you don't have outright civil wars that often or, violent coups. Instead, what you have are demagogues who strangle democracy while pretending to engage in it. For example, Hitler came to power peacefully. He never got 50% of the vote plus, but he was able to use the constitutional system. They had a significant loophole to step in as chancellor. And when he did, after 6 months, he had it. He had power. So if you were going to do something about Hitler, you had to do it from 29 to early 33. After 33, it's cooked. Another reason that what we have in America is extraordinary is, I mentioned, this democratic constitution. So you need a liberal constitutional democracy. It's not enough to have a democracy where you have voting, because you can just kind of have a plebiscite, is what you call it technically in Latin America places. But having a constitution protects individual rights, and we have a Supreme Court. One of their basic jobs, they do it sometimes, not always, is to protect minority rights against majority will that's wrong on an issue, right, to preserve justice. We were lucky that having a revolution itself is awfully difficult, but it's not impossible. But that's not enough. So Madison and Hamilton and George Washington understood that the first governmental system, the Articles of Confederation, were severely flawed and didn't give the national government enough power. And we were going to get picked off one state by one state. And so they put together the Constitutional Convention. A recent revolution that didn't do that and suffered was Egypt when they had the Arab Spring. You know, protesters had organized. We didn't see it because we just saw the square at Cairo. But a lot of work went into that beforehand. And they got rid of Mubarak, but they didn't do the next step. They weren't able to outmaneuver the authoritarian elements in the army and the jihadists, and they never got a constitution written, and now we're back to a military situation. Right. So you need to do the second step of putting in a constitution that works. Now, does ours flawed? I just mentioned we've got some problems. So one, you might say, ours was the first constitution. We were the first big democracy. We led the way. If we'd done the Constitution 40 years later, a lot of things would have been different. We probably wouldn't have had the Electoral College because the founders weren't quite sure would mass democracy work, so they put in some safety things. Every other major democracy, nobody has an Electoral College. It's all by the popular vote, and that's how it should be. That's going to be hard to change, but it's there. So we have certain things that political scientists call kind of anti-majority checks. So you hear checks and balances, but we have probably too many, according to the experts, that kind of stifle majority rule too much, and it's just frustrating. So one is the filibuster. Now, that's not in the Constitution. That is something we should change, I believe. And one of the reasons that we should consider changing it is it, makes it just way too difficult to get things passed through Congress. When politics was working as it used to, say 20, 30 years ago, then you could pass a major piece of legislation with 70 votes in the Senate, and you knew you had a bipartisan consensus. And Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said that's the way to do it. Now the filibuster is not being used that way. It's being used to block things way too much. And it has this legacy going back to slavery. It's got a poison legacy. It was kind of like that was the way to, protect a minority that wasn't doing good stuff. And so I think there's good reasons to get rid of that. We also have 2 senators per state. You're not going to be able to change that anytime soon. But Madison, he was against that. Mm-hmm. He wanted the U.S. Senate. He wanted Montana and California not to be equal, having 2 senators. He wanted California to have representation all of the House of Representatives. So that was one thing. He got 80% of what he wanted because he was the master builder of the Constitution. He put it together. He put together the agenda and the basic ideas.
So Kevin, if I can just pause you for a moment there, I always think, when people talk about our forefathers writing the Constitution and how forward-thinking they really were, right?
Yeah, it was very interesting that they thought hard. They studied history. I mean, they thought through a lot of these problems. They couldn't get it all right. For example, they didn't even they thought political parties would be a bad thing. Then it turned out once we got to kind of members of Congress and stuff, it just was natural to have political parties. So they didn't anticipate that. But at the founding itself, I mentioned Madison. Madison did not want the 2 states. Jefferson and Madison were both very forward-thinking at the time in this sense. Jefferson wrote the Declaration, and it was a committee group, and he was like the junior person he got assigned because everybody else was busy or sick. And it turns out he's a wonderful writer and brilliant, right?
Really?
Well, he didn't get everything he wanted in the final draft, right, when it went to the convention. He got most of it, 80%. One of the significant paragraphs that dropped out was where Jefferson blamed slavery on the English king. Mm-hmm. Now, historically, that wasn't right, but as a rhetorical device to separate us as a country from slavery, that was brilliant.
Yeah.
But of course, the South Carolinians wouldn't go along with it, and it got aced out. Now, Jefferson himself, he could never get over his personal racism. He never could. And he wanted to deal with the black issue. He was going to send, the slaves to the West or send them back to Africa. But he understood that if, as a slave owner, that your kids were growing up in that culture, that they were warped because of what they saw. And he wrote about this in his book, The Notes of Virginia. So Jefferson's interesting on that point, that he's really radical when he writes the Declaration. He's forward-looking. So even though he is seen as, being racist and so forth, sort of like John Locke's another one. John Locke it was known, he's the philosophical writer that we turn to, right? The English philosopher. Well, he had crafted the constitutions for the Carolinas, and that included some slave clauses, right? So people said, well, he wrote this famous book. One of his books starts with how evil slavery is. It's like on the first page. It's like the worst thing ever. But there's new evidence that when he was actually in power, when he actually had authority, he was against slavery. That he praised people who were governors in the colonies. That's the right thing to do. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. And when he wrote this Constitution, he was being employed like a lawyer today to craft something. It wasn't his document. Right? And so that makes it clean that he wasn't a hypocrite, right? So we always think of Jefferson as a hypocrite, Locke as hypocrites about slavery. Well, Jefferson tried hard not to be. He knew he wanted to get rid of slavery because he couldn't himself personally get out of it, but he wanted the future to be rid of it. And Locke also thought it was awful. Madison, a third example, was Madison in the Constitution itself. So Jefferson in the Declaration, then you go to the Constitution 12 years later, 1787. It's got 3/5 slavery and all that kind of language in there. But Madison was very careful and got key colleagues like Washington to support him to make sure that the words slave, slavery, and property of man are not in the federal Constitution. And that was critical because that meant that the Constitution was not sanctioning it. And if you decided to have slavery, that was a state issue. So when you get to Taney and the Dred Scott decision right before the Civil War, Taney's wrong in that decision, and Lincoln calls him out on it. And Lincoln and the abolitionists have the high moral ground based on what Madison did, right? So again, one of the founders was forward-looking. And I found out, a number of those three instances, partially when I researched my book, Madison's Sorrow, was so interesting about the founders, that they, are liberal/conservative in the sense of traditional conservatism, tradition that goes across the whole of American history, where we believe in the founding ideas, we believe in equality, we believe in liberty, we believe in free speech, we believe in the Constitution. That's the dominant strain in American politics, and it's good, but it's aspirational. Like, we're not there yet, right? We had to give the vote to women. We had to get through the Civil War and end slavery. We got to the 60s and full rights for minorities and blacks. And so we're not there yet, and it's an aspirational ideal. And the other thing in my book is to trace the things that are not aspirational, that are legacies of the old world in a way, that want to have caste, want to have class. The racism of the Old South and the way it works politically, and the right wing of the business class that was against the New Deal and always wanted to have liberty, but more liberty for me. Right?
To a degree, or in my terms.
Right, and kind of like we're more comfortable. Both those elements in American political culture are more comfortable with a caste class society. Right? And that goes against what the founding documents aspire to get past that and invent something where it's based on a middle class society, right? And it's based on equality and liberty and democracy all working together.
So at the very beginning of this, you'd mentioned, at the very beginning of the podcast, you'd mentioned a little bit about basically people becoming a little subject to their environment. So what was going on in the culture, that's how basically they behave and the behaviors. What do you think, or how, because it's a very difficult thing to do, back then, Madison and all these different forefathers there, how do you think they struggled because they had to sort of pull themselves out of that environment in order to write this the way you're saying.
It's hard, but they were extending the ideas, these radical ideas that came from the English Revolution, and they came to this country and they said, we want to get away from and say goodbye to all
this.
that.
Right.
We want to say goodbye to the old world.
Right.
And it's stunning in a way. If you look at Thomas Paine's writings, he's got Common Sense, and then he has the Rights of Man, which is a defense of the French Revolution. The preface, the dedication page in the Rights of Man is a dedication, long-winded a little bit for us, to George Washington, saying, we are going to bring, hope and the future to the old world. May the ways of the new world come back to the old world. So he knew, right? People knew we were doing something in revolutionary. It was going to sweep the world. It wasn't just a little American Revolution. We were going to change things, right? And it kind of starts with Locke. And one of the key things in Locke's philosophy is that if you had a kernel to separate it out, is that Locke was one of the first people to say, hey, a peasant thinks just as well as an aristocrat or a king, in terms of your mental capabilities. And he said that. And 100 years after he wrote that, the French Revolution blew up France.
Right.
And you got rid of the king and the aristocracy, and it was gone. Right? So they were trying, it was part of the Enlightenment age, right? They were trying to do something different than caste and class and the old ways of just a small minority running the place and the peasants and everybody else suffering, right? We wanted to move on to something different. Yeah. And they thought they could do it. And a lot of Europeans were skeptical, and that's what kind of stunned Alexis de Tocqueville when he came, was about how well it was working, right? We weren't educated the way people were in Europe, right? But we got along, we had common sense, we knew enough, we read our Bibles, right? And we figured it out.
Right.
And this whole culture kind of took place. We developed this culture, yeah. I'll say this as kind of jumping ahead from the founders. I get asked, have we been through a period like this? Because it's pretty fraught and it's pretty frustrating, and it's chaotic and all the adjectives you can come up with. But we have, and it's an interesting one. From 1880 to 1920 was also a time of great change economically and in terms of the population. So you went from a rural farm economy, everybody's living in small towns or farms, to an urban situation, and a national economy. And all the stuff about it, urban industrial, working in factories, living in big cities. And in addition, we had a big surge of immigration from places we hadn't had immigration from before, right? We had it from southern Italy. We had it from Greece. We had it from Russia. We had all these groups from Eastern Europe. And we had the Chinese, and we had, Latinos from Latin America. We had a bunch.
Well, this is when they were building railroads and things like that, wasn't it?
Yeah. But we got through that. So by 1920, we kind of absorbed that, and it was politics was, we had to come to deal with this, but we got through it, and then things, it was better after that.
So, Kevin, I'm assuming that brings us now to the third element.
Yes, and that is the danger of extremism. So we know that current politics is strange, weird, confusing, but we can't close our eyes to politics just because it's unsettling and polarized. In most decades, it was okay to sit at elections. I'm not recommending that, but this is not one of those times. So this is a time when actually people need to lean in and participate and pay attention. You don't have to go crazy watching cable news and all that, but you have to pay attention as a business owner to the basic patterns that are out there and know the basic facts and find some reliable outlets of news to turn to. A lot of the social media stuff is disinformation. So we've had tough times before, and we've gotten through them because people leaned in. So if you think, the time of the Civil War was a time when there was a big question, right? Are we going to have slavery or not, right? And everybody in the country knew that, and people knew they had to participate even if they didn't participate before. Again, when you got to the 1930s and the Great Depression happens, and before that, it was kind of like government didn't get involved in the economy because it never had, so why would you need it? But when you got a Great Depression, things were so bad. There was no liquidity, there was no money, and Keynes idea as an economist came to fruition. He said, hey, if things are really bad, then the government should chime in and invest money and stimulate the economy to get yourself off the floor and get things pumping again, get things moving again, right? And so Roosevelt tried lots of things, and the people looked at that and said, yeah, we much prefer this to Hoover saying, oh, we can't do anything, and people eating out of trash cans, and you were near starvation and you had 25% unemployment. And so Roosevelt got landslides because the various pieces of the New Deal came together, and nobody wants to go back and get rid of Social Security now, right? And a lot of those programs turned out to be very well done. Yeah, and there were programs during the New Deal that you didn't need all the time, but at the time it was an emergency. So Harry Hopkins was brilliant, and he put together the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which put people to work directly, paid by the government, doing construction projects from city halls to libraries to canals to all kinds of stuff. You can see them in Orange County. There's places, all these buildings were built in the 1930s. A lot of it's WPA work and other programs. That Ronald Reagan's dad didn't have a job. He got employed. He could help his struggling family because of the WPA program. Now, you didn't need that once you got to 1940, but at the time, right, people wanted. So my point is, people responded to Roosevelt and they said, yes, right? This was a good idea to have the government involved in the economy when it's necessary and when it's wise, and not to exclude it, just saying the market can do everything, because sometimes it can't. So now we're in a third situation where, right, we have some people challenging kind of the foundations of the government. We've always had debates about public policy, right? And now we have a situation where some people are questioning elections a lot and whether the democracy is fair, and do we need the system at all? Should we start over? That's wild stuff. And people have to look at what's going on and make a decision, not necessarily as Democrat versus Republican, but who's trustworthy, who is committed to the Constitution, who's committed to the principles of democracy or not, right? And do the right thing. So I think people need to lean in. This is a big election. It counts because of that question is before us.
Now, I just have a quick question for you, because you mentioned something like this just some moments ago. Without having to, name drop or what have you, what is the best source for people to find out that information? Because you mentioned, you've got to be careful about your media or your social media. What would you think would be a good source that people could go and find that information out for themselves?
Well, of the major newspapers are in trouble. So a lot of small newspapers, the Register, the Times, they're not the same as they used to be. But the big national papers are still very disciplined and very much about, journalistic ethics, and they still have the money to do good investigative journalism, and journalists that work very hard and are very diligent and are great professionals work there. So if you look at the New York Times, you look at the Wall Street Journal, you look at the Washington Post, you look at the LA Times, right? Those are credible places to go for news.
To read
in PR. You may say there's a slant, but the basic news is there. And there's a distinction with big newspapers between the editorial page and the editorial voice of a paper and what the newsroom does. Okay. There's a real wall between that. In the social media world, that doesn't exist, right? And if you watch cable news, just take it with a grain of salt, right? Because they're doing their spin to their audience, right? And I'll
do your
leave
research
it there.
And read the paper.
Right.
Yeah.
Read the paper and know where people are sending. If on social media, know where that comes from. Ask where the source is before you believe something that sounds crazy, because probably is.
Yeah. Consider the source.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, why are we in this troublesome time? And I want to turn to that because. Why the way to think about this is, why has American politics worked for nearly 250 years?
Right,
we want to make
time.
it. We want to make it to the birthday, right? Well, yes, we know about checks and balances. Yes, we know about democratic norms and the Bill of Rights and the Supreme Court, all these things, federalism, right? But I would submit one thing we should think about a lot is that America historically has had a lack of real political extremes. We have been extremely fortunate not to have a true far left and not a true far right at the national level. Now, there's always fringe elements, and John McCain was famous for talking some of these people that get elected to Congress as wacko birds. Well, if you have a few wacko birds on the, on the fringe, they're not running the show, right? They don't have real power.
Right.
So I mentioned before, we've had this long-running, dominant strain, kind of like you think of it metaphorically as the Mississippi River, would be this liberal strand of the aspirational ideas of the founding. And traditional conservatives have agreed with that, right? From, if you thought of Hamilton as a business-friendly founder, so he's kind of on the conservative side, all the way through all the great presidents that are on the Republican side, through Ronald Reagan and George the Bushes, okay? That they are part of this conservative tradition. They understand the norms of democracy. They understand you fight during an election and then you govern, right? There's a difference between the two. The rhetoric may get out of hand, as George Bush 41 understood. But they understood there was a commitment to the Constitution, right? And that we can't just throw that away. And they understood if you get beyond this kind of liberal/conservative consensus, you can get in trouble, severe trouble. So when you look at our system from a comparative standpoint, people in the old days would look at us and say, oh, American politics is pretty boring. There's not that much difference between the two parties. We were here. We knew there was some difference between the liberals and the conservatives, right? Yeah. But from a comparative example where they've got all these fringe parties, like way out there, right, doing really anti-democratic stuff, we look like, slow and boring. Right?
Well, you're right. From the outside, and you were saying before, people visiting to find out more. From the outside world, throughout all the time I grew up, America just looked like you had a new president now and again. Everything else, you just continued moving forward and was this powerful, sort of nation. But we were on the outside, right? So,
Yeah, and in terms of that switching presidents, kind of, you have a transition of power. Everybody agrees to give up power, and the new person takes power. And everybody agrees that person was elected legitimately. There's no arguments about that. Yeah. And if you win a change that I noticed that got me interested in this was that when I was young and I was at UCLA, I helped run the student internship program to Washington. And because I ran it, I got some plum assignments, so I ended up working for Tip O'Neill's office when I was there. Well, after the fact, it was really interesting to me that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan got along so well because Tip O'Neill is this really strong New Deal, Massachusetts, old-time liberal, and Reagan's this new conservative from California. Right. But they were both pragmatists. O'Neill understood that Reagan won a big election, got the Senate coattails, the House was still Democratic. But he thought, well, Reagan won this time. He gets to do a lot of his agenda. So Tip O'Neill did not try to block what Reagan was doing. He disagreed with some of it and fought against some of it. But most of it, he was like, okay, he's going to try. It's his turn. He won a national election.
Right.
The presidency is the only office that has a national election. Mm-hmm. When you got to Mitch McConnell and Obama, it was different suddenly because Obama didn't win small elections. He won healthy margins. They weren't landslides, right, like LBJ in the 60s or something like that. And it wasn't quite like a Reagan vote, right? But it was big. And he beat both McCain and Romney by serious margins. Mm-hmm. And then for McConnell, as the leader of the Senate Majority Leader, to come out publicly and say, I'm going to block everything. Yeah. That was odd. Mm-hmm. And just struck me as like, that's different. Like, what's happened? Why are things different now?
Yeah. How did we get there? Right.
Yeah. So let me go back to this point about the danger of the far left and the far right. Is a far left is really defined as people talk about socialism all the time, but there's various brands of that, from very mild to severe. So if you had a Bernie Sanders, say, take over the Democratic Party and win an election, people would freak out. Oh my God, Bernie Sanders is a socialist. he would be more like Denmark or Sweden.
Right.
Last I checked, they're very capitalist. They have some very wealthy companies doing just fine. They believe in civil liberties. If you wanted to change things with a new political direction, you can. Right? But in Sweden, Denmark, and the Scandinavian countries, they're pretty fine with kind of this bigger government and more of a social welfare net.
But it's also a very different way of running government.
Yes.
Totally different system, isn't
Right,
it?
right. So, but it's still within our system of a democratic capitalist country.
Yeah.
When you get a far left, that really means a Marxist-Leninist government, because when Lenin ran the Russian Revolution, he added an element to Marxism that was important, something new. Marx was basically a critic of capitalism. He was brilliant, and you may agree or disagree, but he didn't spend much time in a constitutional system. And neither he nor Lenin believed in a constitutional system because they thought liberalism was just a fig leaf over capitalism. Well, that's a big flaw, because when Lenin took over, he said, okay, we're going to have an intellectual vanguard. We know more than you guys, right? You want to talk about real elite, you're talking about it. And that led to Stalin, right? And Stalin was much worse than Lenin and was a mass killer like Hitler. I mean, just the worst, right? I mean, millions and millions of people died. There's a book called Bloodlands, I think, by Timothy Snyder, about the countries and the people between Germany and Russia, the Soviet Union, that were murdered during that period of the 30s and 40s. So you don't want a far left situation. You don't want a Castro. You don't want somebody who actually is a Marxist-Leninist, because then democracy is gone. Right? Similarly, on the far right, you don't want an authoritarian situation with generals or an oligarch who are not committed to democracy, who are just doing the thing for their small group of friends, right? And just want to use power because they like power, right? Both situations are bad. Now, I don't want us to get in this situation. If we have one extreme, right, and you can be scared of the left or the right listening to this broadcast, right? But if the left or the right in America go too far, and one of them becomes a far right or a far left situation, right, there's a decent chance you're going to get the other extreme coming up too.
The other way, right.
Because Latin America is an example of this. So Latin America, love Latin America. It's a great, the countries are wonderful, but they're stuck in a pattern now where they have like a decade or two of democracy, and then one of the extremes shows up, its ugly head, and takes over.
Right.
And like in Chile, it was awful. People got disappeared. Lots of people were murdered. Pinochet is this brutal military dictator for years, and it's hard to dig out of.
Right.
And it's not good for business, because if an authoritarian takes over that just says, the Constitution, whatever I say is the Constitution, if you end up on the outs with that person, maybe they do something to business regulations that's not friendly to your industry. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe if it's severe, they go after one of your kids. One of your kids ends up in prison. Who knows? There's no constitutional protections.
No protection at all.
Right? Which is really bad. Business does not want to get in that situation. So that leads me to kind of like, what are the warning signs of extremism? One is a retreat from rules of the game. Democracy is not a political system where everything goes. There are rules, right? There are norms. There's ways you do things, and it matters. Just like you can't play baseball and have one team get 4 strikes, right? You can't have, right? You can't change the rules that way because you change the outcome. Second, if elected officials in a legislative branch, and I think we're edging this way with one of the parties, are in lockstep with the leadership, that's a warning sign, because American politics has always had political parties where, you as a representative represent your constituents, right? And you would speak back to the leaders. They might not be happy with it, but you speak back to the leaders of Congress of your party and just say, I can't do that. I gotta represent my constituents. I gotta vote this way, right? But we've had it more where the leaders are kind of dictating how the people that are elected members of Congress vote, and that's not our traditional way of doing things.
Right.
A third is watch language. This is important. You don't want to have politics going from the language of kind of we're rivals with the other side. You know, it's like two teams struggling in high school sports, to enemies. You don't want to go to a situation where you start to say, well, there's friends and there's enemies. That echoes one of the famous Nazi philosophers, a guy named Schmidt, who wrote about this eloquently. He was a really smart guy, but his philosophy, you know, was part of the evil that was the Nazis. Right. And he said, you know, there's friends and then there's enemies. Well, if the other side are enemies,
that's not a good term, is it?
No, it basically allows you to do whatever you want with those people.
Yeah.
And it could be mild to severe to death camps, right? You just that's really bad. So you don't want people starting to disparage the other side and see people as the enemy, as them, us, them.
Them, right.
We've never been an us-them society, you know, and we need to, you know, push back against that.
Yeah, dividing is not good at all, is it?
Right. And I've got a little story here about this. When I was young, I was in the Choral Foundation, and we went up to Sacramento, and we're watching from the rafters, you know, a debate about education policy. And people are just going at it. I mean, it's like they just really disagree. Well, then kind of was surprised in a way. After the fact, you know, 5 o'clock comes, 6 o'clock, whenever they finish the debate, all the legislators go to the same bar, Frank Fats, right? And we follow along. And these, you know, people that are Democrats and Republicans, they're like, turned out they're best friends, even though they were just squabbling with each other about this bill.
Yeah.
So it's a lot like, we want politics to go back to that. We want it to be back like the old days of Frank Fats. We want it to be where Scalia and Ginsburg disagree on judicial philosophy. They do not see things the same way, but they're like best friends. They respect each other. We have to respect the other side. They're not enemies. A final thing is along with this, the change in language is when threats of violence and actual violence takes place. That's a real, you know, point where extremism is starting to take root.
Right.
You don't want politicians being intimidated. You look at the new Mitt Romney book, right? He talks about some people in his party were fearful, you know, about what would happen to their family, that they were getting threats.
Right.
We don't want a politics where threats are going around and where violence starts happening. That's you're getting a breakdown of democracy when that happens. So let me return to Juan Lentz that I started with. If you took one thing away from this podcast, take this, that when politics is normal, we have debates about public policy all over the map, but we're loyal to the system. When politics gets in trouble, according to Lentz, and I think this is just true, you end up with three groups. You end up with people that are normal, and are loyal to the Constitution and understand how politics happen. I'm going to disagree with you. We're going to debate, and we'll come up with a vote. That's the loyal group. But you get two other groups. One, way over on the side, are the extremists who are disloyal to the system, right? And there's some people out there right now who are disloyal to the system, who want to break it, have no loyalty to it. But that's not the key, because those people are a distinct minority. The key group, especially at the political level, are the people in political parties who are semi-loyal to the Constitution. They want people, their voters and constituents, to think that they're normal politicians and doing the normal thing, but they continually take actions and say things, or they're quiet, maybe they're complicit with the extremists, and they're apologists. And they keep doing actions and words that benefit the far fringe of their party and make it more and more powerful. They don't push back when it's really their job to push back. And we as constituents and as business people and as voters, we have the power to say to our representatives, and we should, I like your policies so-and-so, right? Representative so-and-so. But I want to make sure that you are loyal to the Constitution and you believe in your oath and you're going to follow the dictates of democracy, and you're going to believe if the courts say the election's over, the election's over. Right? And you're not going to mess with the Constitution, because that's not what you're there to do. You're representing me, and I'm loyal to the system. So we need people to start messaging their representatives and saying, hey, are you on the same page with me? Because in reality, we want it, and it really is a binary choice, right? It's not a three-way thing. It's really, are you loyal or are you disloyal?
I suppose that makes sense.
As a politician, if you have to waffle and you can't quite say, am I loyal to democracy, right, and the Constitution, then you've got a problem, right? As a democratically elected politician, you're playing an authoritarian game.
Yeah.
Okay. To be frank.
So, Kevin, I'm learning so much today. So I really do appreciate all the information you're feeding us, and a few things that you touched on there. I just would like to bring it home a little bit more closer. So some of the things that the chambers do, particular our chamber, is we try and get all these government officials, senators, congressmen and women, assemblymen and women together to meet with our members. And the idea is to have more of a free chit-chat with each other, rather than people thinking, oh, government are going to do whatever they want to do and we've got to live our lives. Can you share a little bit about how important it is that people do chat and how legislation really sometimes changes due to that? Yes, Andrew. I think that's true. I mean, we kind of see government as off over there a lot, right? Because we're busy with our family and our business and so forth. But the government is us and these elected officials who we've elected as our representatives. And politicians are a special breed in the sense that they're very attuned to public opinion and what they hear. Because their careers are dependent on getting elected. And if you are in politics and you think about running and winning an election is hard. And the higher up you get in the system, the harder it is. There's lots of competition. It involves a lot. I mean, some people might be great legislators, but they could never get there because they have to master campaigning. So the number one for many people, whether this is a good or bad thing, is getting reelected. They want to keep that position because it took them time and effort and part of their lifespan to get to this job, right? And they like it. That said, successful politicians are very attuned to public opinion, and they listen. And they listen to the currents that are out there. So when you come to one of these mixers of the chamber, bring up a bill that the chamber's alerted to, or you maybe knew was coming down the pack, where you said, that's okay, but you need to change it. Or maybe this law is crazy. Don't ever do this. Express your opinions about legislation that affects you and your business, and also about your community and so forth. But also think about where we are as a country and the political system. And don't be shy about letting people know that you're very loyal to the Constitution and democracy, and you want to keep see it going forward, and you want people to make statements, public statements as public officials, that I will abide by the Constitution and the results of the election. I have no trouble with our electoral system, and you're that they're basically back to what we were just talking about, that they're loyal to American democracy, because that's what we want. Right? So don't be shy about talking about that as well as a particular public policy, because and politicians, they'll listen if they hear enough of that, right? And not just from the extremists, right? That they don't want to lose their position. Many people, one of our problems is this in terms of the political situation is, in the old days, parties and politicians ran more to the middle. Right? And some people who are kind of in this broad civic middle feel ignored. And this is one of the issues I'll bring up. I think I'll go this way, that it's a myth in a way that the country's 50-50. Right? That's not true. It may be a better way that makes us can feel better about the whole situation is the country's like a broad civic middle of 80% plus. 80% of us as citizens and as business people understand what democracy requires. We understand we're not going to get everything we want every election, and there's another election ahead of that. We don't want to be in a situation where we seem desperate, like we can't let those people in. That's not a situation we want to be in. And to get out of it, we need to talk to people. A lot of people don't participate. We don't have the highest participation in the world, right?
right? So we can have conversations with our neighbors and friends and say, hey, you need to, if you register to vote, make sure you show up. Make sure you focus on this question about democracy and the Constitution, along with whatever policy issue that you want your politician to favor, right? And that has an effect. That has an effect. And that brings us to my last topic, which is that I want to talk a little bit about business and politics from a macro perspective.
Oh, okay.
And discuss what political scientists call the privileged position of business. Mm-hmm. Now, this is going to seem a little counterintuitive, but it's really true. Democratic capitalism is a political system that powers the growth and economic vitality that we see all around us in Orange County. And business people enjoy a critical position in our democratic system, one that they should be proud of and protect. And let me explain it. The chambers, such as this one, they represent the interests of business locally and in Sacramento and Washington. And because of, just the situation of lobbying for certain legislation, trying to get as much of what the business community would like to see, it sometimes seems as if it's an adversarial relationship. For example, the chambers every year come out, the statewide chamber comes out with a list of kind of like with the job killer bills. Mm. Well, that's certainly true. You want to be aware that some of the legislation before it gets passed, because it's harder to deal with it once it gets passed, right? Yeah. And this is interesting. I'll get to this in a minute. Like governors, even if they're liberals, are often more centrist when they become governor than they were before, because they have to think about the economy. Now, let me dive right into that. Mm-hmm. In Western-style democracies, there are really two sets of leaders. And as business people, you're one of them. There's political leaders and there's business leaders. And those two sets of leaders are more important than anybody else. Mm-hmm. They're far more important than union leadership or environmental leadership, or pick whatever interest group you can pick.
Right.
And so business people enjoy a privileged position because political leaders cannot order them to make the economy run. Mm-hmm. But political leaders need the economy to run well. Right. Okay? So you have leverage, right?
Yeah.
And they need business people to hire people, in their locale and their state. And they need to make they want people to make investments so the economy hums. And it's such that this need is so powerful that even if the chamber didn't exist, and I'm not suggesting that, right? But even if chambers of commerce did not exist and business people were looking out their windows away from Sacramento and never got on the phone to call Sacramento or Washington or even the city council, right? Just ignored the whole political system. Mm-hmm. The setup, the fact that business is separate from the government, means that the governmental leaders have to do things to induce, to incentivize business to do what is needed so there is full employment.
Right.
And not a lot of unemployment. That's really bad.
Too,
that's bad for politicians. If there's high unemployment, if there's high inflation, whenever the economy gets messed up, political leaders hear about it and they're supposed to fix it, but they kind of have to do it indirectly by putting in place the right incentives, right? And that's why these governors, if they even were, say, liberal legislators, when they get to the governor's position, suddenly they're vetoing bills they might have supported before. Yeah. Because governors and mayors and presidents get this. Yeah. They really understand it. Okay? So business has this position. And it's a feedback loop, right? So in an autocratic system, on the other hand, right, where it's a dictatorship, it's an oligarchy, whatever, and you don't have a constitutional democracy, that feedback loop isn't there, right? The people who are cronies to the leader, like in Putin's Russia, right, they get the juice. But if they fall out of favor, good luck.
They're out,
right? So this change, we didn't have such a system until the Great Depression. But once the Great Depression happened, every country in the world ended up with a national bank, a Federal Reserve, and regulations of Wall Street. For example, the Wall Street crash of '29 was partially caused because it was murky. Nobody knew what was really going on. And get this, the government regulations, one of my favorite things about the New Deal, I didn't know, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is created out of the Roosevelt administration in the 30s, that was a win-win-win in the sense that it creates an industry, the accounting industry, of saying you've got to produce public reports every quarter to show us what your profits and losses are. And you're under federal law to tell the truth about what you're doing as a business, so investors know, right? That was a good thing. It set up rules. It didn't challenge Wall Street's power. It said, Wall Street, you should be more clear to all these investors across the country about what's really going on. So it's not just a couple sneaky people behind the scenes pulling wires, right? We want it to be open. So you did that. So this privileged position is there. It exists. But, it's a special position. But along with that, we should think of it this way. Even though some regulations are too much, right? And certain taxes are too high, right? And you can always have complaints. Business has both special protections and great leverage in a democratic capitalist system such as ours. Right. And business people should not give that up lightly. Right. If it ever was challenged. Because it would be foolish for business owners to give up on a system that protects and empowers them in this way and allows them the freedom to grow and allows them a court system where if they have problems, they can go to the courts, and everybody follows what the judges say, right? In an autocratic system, all of a sudden the judges are corrupted, right? And there's a court system, but it's not really...
It's not really a fair court system.
Yeah, right? And so this is a quote from the journalist John Harwood. He wrote this as a tweet recently. He said, an influential chunk of the political world, rich individuals and business executives, they have been willing to look past behavior by politicians that at a normal time would be called out because they crave tax cuts and reduced regulation. So in a way, that's normal, right? But Harwood continued, but I bet they'll regret it if and when those people, those business people and rich investors suddenly discover that part of the tax cut package is really the decay of law, the rule of law, and the decay of competent governance that allows a democratic capitalism to thrive, right? You don't have the feedback loop. You don't have the legal protection. All of a sudden, people are Treasury Secretary that don't know what the hell they're doing, and there's no way to really put pressure on to say, get rid of that Treasury Secretary. This guy's, change your economic policy, right? Because otherwise, if you don't, I'm supporting the other party, and we're going to kick you out. Right. We have a feedback loop. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. So you don't want to do that. So the further point I want to bring up is with this special position, with this privilege that the business community has, comes responsibility. Right. And they need to step up as guardians of freedom. Now, during the long Cold War, it was understood by conservatives and liberals across the West that the big problem in the Soviet Union was there was no market, that the government was trying to do everything. And that was insane, one, because government bureaucrats can't decide how a factory is going to work. Right. And then once the economy gets more sophisticated, there's no way to do that.
Well, you have to experience enough, are you, to do all that? Yeah.
You have, it's too complicated.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And liberal economists and conservative economists all agree about this. You have to use the price system. So that said, what we understood in addition from a political angle was having a private sector was really important as a check against authoritarianism or communist rule or whatever bad elements running the government. Right. If you have a separate private sector, then you have some people with resources and business power to act against the government that's gone bad. Right? And so during the whole Cold War, we understood this is one of the reasons that liberals like Arthur Schlesinger, one of John F. Kennedy's leading advisors, and other people thought, you've got to have business is great, partially because of this. We want we want capitalism to thrive. Now, somebody like Schlesinger and Obama, for example, they would be more willing to, do more government programs and have more regulations and stuff, right? But that comes within kind of like the sphere that is legitimate liberal democratic situation. So if you get a change of heart, you can go the other direction,
the other way,
right? You can always go the other direction. If you end up with one of these extremes, you can't change course without somehow overthrowing the government.
It's like a regular business plan. You're able to pivot if it goes the right way or if it goes the wrong way.
There you go.
Right.
That's a good way to put it. So I'll be blunt about this. Precisely because business leaders often have access to and control more financial resources and political power than regular citizens, it's incumbent on them to pay attention to the political world, and if things start to go haywire, take action to return politics to a normal state of affairs. We want to go back to where things are normal, where we can talk to each other, where we can reach compromises, right? Where the parties, we don't want the parties to go, we don't want either party to go too far in one direction or the other, because then the American system freezes up. It doesn't work, and then really bad things can happen. So let me say in conclusion that I think we're going to be fine, but to be fine, people have to lean in and engage, not back away. And we need to take to heart the wise words of Edmund Burke. He was the English statesman way back, and a father of conservatism. He's one of my favorite writers. And in his book, The Reflections on the Revolution in France, he wrote, "All that is necessary for the forces of evil to win in the world is for enough good men to do nothing." So the message is we need good men and women to step up and, do their civic duty, engage with their legislators, right? Yeah. Just like what you're setting up this Friday.
Yeah.
Do those kinds of things. And we want to stop extremism. Extremism is a spiral, and you want to stop extremism early. It gets harder the more you let it go on. Some people kind of want to bury their heads and just say, "Oh, this will pass." Well, sometimes things build up,
right,
and things get worse.
You have to do something.
And you can have in any country, you can have an intense minority that's really driven, try to intimidate everybody and kind of bully their way to power. We don't want that to happen, and we want to kind of go back to kind of when politics is normal. So the three things we can do are, make sure your elected officials are committed to the Constitution, the rule of law, free and fair elections. Second thing you can do is when elections take place, and we're going to have a primary in March. It's early this year because California changed the primary date to be part of the presidential election, but it gets confusing because wait, it's in March? So it's going to be, we got a Senate race on that ballot too. So that's a big deal. And that's a top two. So you want to vote for that. When you go to vote, and I think voting in person is a nice thing. You can do it by mail in California, but if you go in person, make sure you thank the election workers, right? Because they're getting flack some places. It's a noble calling. It's the right thing to do, and sometimes it can get a little tough, and they'll appreciate that. And third, get your neighbors, your friends, your business colleagues to engage and vote. Tell them this is an important election coming up. You don't have to tell them how to vote, but say that, remind them it's important that they participate and pay attention. And we don't want to leave, kind of final message, we don't want to leave politics to the super partisans and the extremes, right? There's this 80% civic middle that's out there that how we have different positions on some different issues, but we're all Americans, we get along, we know how the system works, we like the system. It's like one of the best ones in the world, right? And we've faced challenges before. It's not like it's D-Day where we have to put our lives on the line. Right. We just have to kind of show up, right? It's pretty easy. So we need to recognize bad behavior and call it out when we see it. Insist that elected officials are true to their oath of office, and remind people that they should vote for democracy. Vote for democracy when it comes up. So thank you very much.
So, Kevin, I always ask people as we're wrapping up, have you got anything to say? But we know we're going to be doing another episode, and we're going to be talking more about your book, so we'll do that in a moment. Those are extremely good points that you were just mentioning there, and I know we touched it in the podcast, but as it's a final moment, getting involved. So we mentioned before about the newspapers, reading certain newspapers to find out who really is doing what and who's really trying to centralize themselves. What other types of things do you think the general public listeners can do to really get rid of that noise that's going on out there to really concentrate on who they might want to vote for?
I would say this. It sounds strange for a political science journalist, but I would reduce time watching cable news.
Right.
I think that the cable news stuff, because they're doing spin for their own audience, they're chasing ratings, whatever persuasion they are, right? Across the spectrum. You can make yourself crazy, right? Because they're trying to get people to watch, right? They're trying to stir up your emotions, and it's not good. We'll do better if people kind of tune that out. Maybe you watch it once a week, right? Your favorite show, if you have one. But just kind of, read some books about American politics. Calm yourself down. Try not to get so. I think we get
emotionally involved.
We get upset, and it's been going on a while, and we just want it to be over, and we just have to understand. Other countries have gone through tough times, and sometimes things are tough for a while. And if you look at Britain, for example, where they had real tough times in World War II, right, all of a sudden France falls to Germany. It's all of a sudden Britain's alone. When Churchill finally gets power, because neither party liked him, he was telling people for years about Hitler, and they wouldn't listen. And then they put him in right when things are almost like in the toilet, literally. Like
it's too late. Figure it out.
Figure it out. That great movie, The Darkest Hour, is very true. He's got to deal with people in his cabinet and in the English power structure that want to make a deal with Hitler via Mussolini. It's true. Halifax wants to make a deal because Halifax thinks it's over, and from a rational perspective, it doesn't look good. And then Churchill looks at what's happening, and he comes with this creative thing. Says, we can get the troops out of Dunkirk. We're just going to send every private boat we can. Right. And it works. They lose all the equipment, but they save 3/4 of the army. And then they turn around. It turns out the English had just as good fighter planes, the Spitfire and the Hurricane as the Messerschmitt. And they had Air Force commanders who had been thinking, what are we going to do if something like this happens? And so the Battle of Britain was pivotal. Britain's all alone. They cannot give up. What the Germans were trying to get was air superiority over the beaches in southern England. And RAF fought them to a standstill. And it wasn't just the bravery of the pilots, which was certainly there, but it was the tactics and the smarts of strategy, right, that they thought about it. And they just gutted it out. It took a long time. And then America doesn't come into the war for like a year and a half. It takes a long time. And a bunch of defeats by the British, but they stay with it. They stay with it. So, we went through the Civil War. God knows we don't want to do that. Civil War is a bad word. We should not use it. There was a great essay by this Fintan O'Toole in The Atlantic maybe a year ago where he talked about growing up in Northern Ireland, and that his dad came home one day and said, it's going to be a civil war. And Fintan said, I'm like 16 then. And it turned out it was the Troubles, right? Got very bad, a lot of violence, a lot of bombings, serious trouble. But he said, it was never a civil war. It was the Troubles, which were really bad. But he said, just talking about the Civil War kind of made that happen. So we need to reduce that kind of talk, right? We need to kind of get a hold of ourselves, say, this is a fraught time. Don't be overpowered by all the chaos that's out there. Think straight, right? We can do this. We've had difficult times before. There are things that are a little bit choppy, right? The water's a little choppy. Can we get through this? Yeah. We just have to get enough people who are sane like ourselves to show up and do the right thing when they vote, and to vote for the system, vote for democracy, and we'll get through this. Right. And the parties hear messages, right? Eventually the parties will hear messages about where we want the country to go, this kind of broad civic middle, right? So we need to voice that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you, audience, for listening to Chamber Talk, brought to you by North Orange County Chamber of Commerce.